Springfield Armory, Massachusetts, January 1936. Snow drifted over the old stone walls of the Springfield Armory, muffling the clatter of machinery inside. Steam hissed from the foundry vents. The smell of oil and hot metal hung thick in the winter air. Inside the testing range, a man in a grease-stained apron adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and looked down the sights of a prototype rifle, unlike anything the U.S. Army had ever seen. His name was Jean Cantius Garand, known simply as John Garand now. A French-Canadian immigrant self-taught machinist and obsessive tinkerer who had spent the last 15 years fighting against failure, skepticism, and bureaucracy in equal measure. He stood barely 5'7", quiet, methodical, and as precise as the gears he designed. In front of him rested his creation, a self-loading rifle that could fire 8 rounds without manual cycling. To most officers in 1936, it looked like blasphemy. To Garand, it looked like the future. Ready on the line, called out Colonel Hatcher, Chief of Testing. The range sergeant flicked on the target lights. Garand inserted the clip 8 rounds of .30-06 Springfield. The metallic ping of the clip locking in place was sharp, almost musical. He pulled the bolt, exhaled, and squeezed the trigger. Bang, 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 bang. 8 flashes in just under 5 seconds. Empty brass tinkled onto the concrete. Then, with a crisp mechanical snap, the clip ejected, flying into the air with that distinctive ringing ping. The officers watching behind the glass murmured. No bolt to lift, no magazine to reload after each shot, just pure, uninterrupted firepower. Garand lowered the rifle smoke curling from the barrel. He didn't smile. He never did. But his eyes, calm and dark, carried quiet satisfaction. Outside the range, skepticism brewed. One ordnance officer muttered, "Too complicated. Too many moving parts." Another added, "Soldiers will jam it before they fire 2 rounds." A third shook his head. "We don't need a peasant's toy. We need reliability, not fireworks." Garand heard them, though he pretended not to. He'd heard it all before, the laughter, the mockery, the nickname whispered behind his back, the dreamer from Quebec. But he knew something they didn't. He had tested the rifle through mud, rain, and frost. It never failed him. It was light enough for infantry, durable enough for combat, and most importantly, it gave a single soldier the firepower of 2. That night, after the officers left, Garand stayed in the workshop long past midnight. The clang of metal echoed through the armory as he adjusted the gas-operated mechanism, a marvel of simplicity hidden inside the rifle's graceful frame. He paused, listening to the ticking of a nearby clock. In that quiet, he thought of his childhood in Quebec, the cold winters, the factory noise, his father's rough hands guiding his first metal lathe. He remembered arriving in America as a teenager, speaking little English, dreaming of machines that worked not just by muscle, but by imagination. And now, standing alone among the whirring tools of the Springfield Armory, he realized something. This wasn't just a rifle. It was proof that an immigrant could change the destiny of an empire, one design, one round, one idea at a time. Weeks later, a telegram arrived from Washington. The U.S. Army Ordnance Board had reviewed his submission. The rifle was officially designated United States Rifle Caliber .30 M1. Garand read the telegram twice before folding it carefully into his pocket. He didn't cheer. He didn't even tell anyone. He simply walked back to his bench, picked up a file, and began refining the trigger group. Because for him, success wasn't final. It was another step in a long line of improvements yet to come. But in the months that followed, the project nearly died. Production delays plagued the armory. Machinists struggled to replicate Garand's tolerances. Budget cuts hit the Ordnance Department hard. Some in Washington began whispering again, maybe we went too far. Maybe the old Springfield bolt action is enough. One memo circulated to senior officers read, "The M1 rifle remains unproven for field conditions. Recommend suspension pending further evaluation." Garand saw it on Colonel Hatcher's desk one morning. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and went back to the range to prove again that he was right. On March 1, 1937, the first 50 production rifles rolled off the line. They were crude, inconsistent, and heavy, But they fired. Garand tested each one personally. He adjusted, redesigned, improved. He replaced brittle parts, simplified the bolt lock, redesigned the gas system. Every failure was another line in his invisible notebook, another lesson in perfection. He told one machinist, "A weapon is like a promise. It must never fail the man who trusts it." The machinist nodded and muttered, "Then we better make damn sure it doesn't." Fast, accurate, rugged, and completely unlike anything the Axis powers had. The U.S. Army began mass production, issuing the rifle to infantry divisions preparing for war. And still some doubted it. One general said, "It's too modern. The men won't handle it." Another argued semi-automatic rifles waste ammunition. But those voices would vanish soon, drowned out by the thunder of thousands of M1s firing in unison across two oceans. In December 1941, as the smoke of Pearl Harbor cleared, America awoke to war. Factories that once made typewriters and washing machines now turned out rifles by the millions. And in every crate-stamped Springfield armory, the name M1 Garand gleamed under oiled metal. The immigrant's dream had become the arsenal of democracy. And soon his creation would roar across North Africa, Italy, Normandy, and beyond, changing forever how soldiers fought and how nations remembered them. North Africa, November 1942. The desert wind howled through the shattered buildings of Oran, Algeria, whipping up sand that stung the eyes and filled the air with the smell of cordite and diesel. The men of the 1st Infantry Division, the big red one, crouched behind a low wall as German machine gun fire raked the street ahead. Corporal Frank DeSantis, 23 years old from Ohio, gripped the unfamiliar rifle in his hands and muttered, "Hell of a place to try something new." It was the first time the M1 Garand was being tested in battle. The invasion of North Africa, known as Operation Torch, was supposed to be a proving ground, not just for America's green soldiers, but for its new tools of war. Until now, most armies on Earth fought with bolt-action rifles, slow, deliberate weapons designed for 19th century tactics. The Germans had their Carabiner 98K, the British their Lee Enfield. But here, under the North African sun, the United States carried something different. Something faster, louder, deadlier. DeSantis peered through a haze of dust. Ahead, a German MG-34 burst into life, cutting the air with staccato fury. Covering fire, someone yelled. DeSantis took a deep breath and rose from cover, his M1 braced against his shoulder. He fired. The rifle kicked hard but smooth, the gas system cycling with a mechanical chonk. He fired again, and again. 8 shots in seconds, clean, sharp, unstoppable. When the last round fired, the clip flew free with that now famous metallic ping. The Germans paused just for a heartbeat, as if unsure what they'd heard. DeSantis ducked back behind the wall, heart pounding, fumbling for another clip. Private Murphy beside him stared in disbelief. "Jesus, Frank, that thing doesn't stop," DeSantis grinned through the dust. "Yeah, I think they're the ones stopping now. Rate of fire exceptional. Enemy shocked by volume of fire from infantry." The experiment was over. The verdict was clear. The Garand was no longer a curiosity, it was a revolution. In a tent a few miles from the front, an ordnance officer scribbled a letter to Washington. "The semi-automatic rifle gives our troops overwhelming superiority in close engagements. Recommend immediate expansion of M1 production. Men report high confidence in weapon reliability under field conditions." That letter would make its way to the desk of General George C. Marshal Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. He read it, tapped his pen against the paper, and said quietly, "This changes everything." On the far side of the Atlantic, German intelligence intercepted reports of this semi-automatic rifle. A colonel in the Wehrmacht's Ordnance Division scoffed. "Impossible. No rifle can fire so fast and remain accurate. American propaganda." He was wrong. By 1943, German soldiers in Tunisia would begin calling it Die 8-Schuss Tod, the 8-shot death. Meanwhile, at the Springfield Armory, John Garand was still at his workbench, surrounded by blueprints, test data, and a growing mountain of correspondence. He'd seen photos of the rifle in combat, heard reports of its success, but fame never interested him. When asked by a reporter about his invention, he simply said, "It works." That's what matters. His superiors offered him bonuses, patents, and royalties. He declined them all. "I work for the government," he said. "The rifle belongs to the soldiers." Even President Roosevelt tried to intervene. But Garand refused every dollar, every decoration. His only reward was knowing that his design, once mocked as impractical, was now saving American lives by the thousands. In North Africa, soldiers were discovering something else about the M1. It wasn't just its speed that mattered, it was its reliability. Dust, sand, and heat destroyed lesser weapons. The Garand kept firing. When oiled properly and cleaned once a day, it became almost indestructible. By spring 1943, the Army had gathered enough data to make a bold claim: the M1 Garand was the first truly modern rifle in history. The men who carried it began to form an almost superstitious bond with their rifles. Each one had its own quirks, a particular sound, a pattern of recoil, a smoothness to the bolt. They named them, they cleaned them obsessively, and they trusted them like brothers. DeSantis wrote in his journal, "The M1 doesn't jam. It doesn't quit. It fires when I need it to. Maybe it's not a rifle, maybe it's a promise." That phrase would later appear in a Stars and Stripes article about the new weapon transforming America's fighting man. When the campaign in North Africa ended, the Army collected hundreds of after-action reports. They all said the same thing: the rifle had performed flawlessly. The only complaint soldiers made: it was too good. The volume of fire it enabled forced supply officers to double the ammunition allotment. Back at the Pentagon, one logistics officer groaned, "The damn thing's too efficient. We can't keep the bullets coming fast enough," but no one dared suggest going back. In the factories of Massachusetts and Illinois, women machinists, rosies with goggles and rolled-up sleeves, began assembling Garands around the clock. Production jumped from 100 rifles a day to nearly 1,000 by late 1943. Each one was stamped U.S. Rifle Cal 30 M1, and each one carried the spirit of a quiet immigrant who refused to give up on a dream. By the time the Allies prepared for the invasion of Italy, nearly 1 million Garands had been shipped overseas. The German generals still dismissed it as an American novelty, but in the hills near Salerno, they would soon see its full fury. The men of the 36th Infantry Division advanced through olive groves under mortar fire. The sound of the Garands echoed through the valley, crisp, rhythmic, unrelenting. It wasn't just gunfire anymore. It was the mechanical heartbeat of an army awakening to its strength. That night, as the sun sank behind the Mediterranean, DeSantis sat cleaning his rifle under the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. He looked at the steel, the wood, the flawless precision of it all, and he thought of the man who built it, a man he'd never met, but whose creation now defined the difference between life and death. He whispered quietly, "Whoever you are, thank you." And somewhere 1,000 miles away, in a Massachusetts workshop, John Garand tightened one last screw, wiped the oil from his hands, and prepared to improve the weapon even further, because to him, perfection was never enough. Italy, December 1943. Rain lashed the cliffs of San Pietro in Fine, a mountain village turned fortress. The winter mud sucked at boots and swallowed wheels. Every valley echoed with artillery rolling thunder that shook the stones loose from ruined farmhouses. The U.S. Fifth Army, climbing those ridges, faced the brutal test of Italy's terrain, its weather, and a German army that refused to yield an inch. Sergeant James Hollingsworth Company, E-36th Infantry Division, crouched behind a fallen wall, his hands slick with rain and mud. The Garand across his knees glistened the walnut stock, dark from moisture. Behind him, Private O'Connor cursed as he loaded clips into his pouch. "They said this was supposed to be a vacation front," O'Connor muttered. Hollingsworth barked a low laugh. "Sure. If your idea of a vacation is hell with spaghetti. Objective, take the ridge above the village. Estimated casualties high." At dawn, the rain turned to sleet. The squad advanced in staggered bursts, their boots crunching against frost-hardened mud. The Germans opened fire almost immediately, MG-42s rattling from the slopes like sewing machines of death. Hollingsworth dropped flat, returned fire with 2 sharp shots. His M1 barked like thunder, the recoil familiar and steady. The rifle cycled cleanly, the gas piston driving the bolt with perfect timing. He spotted movement in a window, fired twice. A figure slumped out of view. O'Connor shouted, "You hit him!" "Does it matter?" Hollingsworth yelled back. "Keep moving." Rifles dropped in mud, soaked in sleet, or filled with dust still fired. Where bolt-action rifles jammed or froze, the Garand answered with unwavering rhythm. A war correspondent embedded with the division wrote later, "You can hear the Garands before you see the men. A symphony of steel that never falters even in the storm." By noon, the Americans had pushed halfway up the ridge. The slope was littered with shell craters, spent casings, and broken helmets. German mortars rained fire from above. Hollingsworth reached the next wall and yelled, "Cover me!" He broke into a sprint, his boots sliding on the mud. A burst of fire chewed the dirt near his legs. He dropped behind a stone pile, caught his breath, then leaned out and returned fire. Each trigger pull was instinct now, 8 rounds reload, ping, new clip and fire again. The rifle had become part of him, an extension of his pulse, his will, his survival. At the same moment, 30 miles north, an army photographer captured a photo that would soon make headlines back home. A soldier kneeling in the mud, rifle raised, smoke curling from the barrel, his face half shadow, half light. The caption would read, "The rifle that won the ridge." Dozens of Americans lay wounded or dead among the olive trees. But the Germans had withdrawn, forced out not by artillery or tanks, but by relentless riflemen. As medics moved among the fallen, Hollingsworth sat against a ruined wall, cleaning his rifle with a rag torn from his sleeve. His hands were trembling from exhaustion, but his weapon gleamed. A war correspondent approached him. "Sergeant, mind if I ask, what do you think of that rifle?" Hollingsworth looked down at it, smiled faintly, and said, "I think it's the reason I'm still breathing." Officers at Springfield read the letters aloud to their teams, each one proof that the M1 was performing beyond expectations. The weapon remains dependable in all climates. Soldiers express high confidence in accuracy and rate of fire. Enemy prisoners confirm fear of U.S. infantry firepower. In Washington, General George S. Patton received similar dispatches. After examining the rifle during an inspection in Sicily, he famously declared, "In my opinion, the M1 rifle is the greatest battle implement ever devised." The quote was printed in newspapers across the country. And with that, the M1 Garand wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol. John Garand received the clipping by mail. He studied the photo of soldiers in Italy, their faces blackened by smoke, his rifle clutched in every hand. He smiled for perhaps the first time in years. But even as his co-workers congratulated him, Garand returned to his drafting table, pencil poised over blueprints. "Good enough," he murmured, "isn't good enough." He was already sketching the next evolution of his design. The war had vindicated him, but he was thinking beyond it. In the winter of 1943, American industry reached full stride. Factories in Springfield, Winchester, and International Harvester turned out Garands faster than any weapon before it. Women worked lathes and milling machines with precision that rivaled the finest peacetime engineers. Every shift ended with the same ritual, the foreman holding up a finished rifle, inspecting it, and stamping it with U.S. Rifle Cal 30 M1. Each one cost $85 to make. Each one could fire 8 shots in 2 seconds. Each one could save the man's life. In the spring, when the first shipments reached the ports of England, British officers examined the Garand in disbelief. One colonel remarked, "You Yanks have built a rifle that thinks it's a machine gun." An American ordnance officer grinned. "No, sir. We've built a rifle that wins wars." Those same rifles would soon fill the decks of the transports bound for Normandy. The men who carried them didn't know it yet, but the weapon forged in a Massachusetts workshop would soon thunder across the beaches of France, carving its legacy into the steel heart of history. That night, as the rain subsided over the mountains of Italy, Hollingsworth wrapped his rifle in his poncho and leaned back against the trench wall. He lit a cigarette and watched the stars flicker through breaks in the clouds. Somewhere far away, the man who made his rifle was probably asleep in a warm bed, dreaming of blueprints. "Thanks, pal," he whispered into the dark. Then he closed his eyes, the Garand resting across his lap, and let the sound of the wind lull him into the first peaceful sleep he'd had in months. June 6, 1944, the sea was black and furious. At 0430 hours, the gray shapes of landing craft rose and fell in the cold Atlantic surf. The wind whipped spray over the faces of the men packed shoulder to shoulder, their helmets slick with salt water. Each clutched the same rifle, the M1 Garand, its oiled metal glinting in the dim light of dawn. Private Thomas Riley, 19 from New York, checked his weapon again for the 10th time. He ran a hand along the stock, feeling the familiar warmth of the walnut, the weight that had become an extension of his body. He whispered almost like a prayer, "Don't jam." Not today. The engines roared, drowning out the sound of distant thunder, except it wasn't thunder. It was the echo of naval guns hammering the coast of Normandy. The ramp dropped. For an instant, the world turned white with explosions. Men plunged into freezing water rifles held high above their heads. Bullets sliced through the waves like invisible knives. Riley hit the surf, chest deep, his helmet ripped off by the current. He stumbled forward, lungs burning, clutching the Garand with both hands. "Move! Move!" Machine gun fire raked the water from the bluffs above. The first wave of soldiers was cut down before they reached the sand. But the M1s kept firing through water, through mud, through fear. Riley dropped behind a steel obstacle, heart hammering. A German MG-42 chattered from a pillbox to his right. He slammed a clip into his rifle, ping-click-chonk, and popped up to fire. The recoil was solid, the sound deafening. He could barely see through the smoke, but he fired again, adjusting instinctively, his training kicking in. Around him, the same metallic rhythm filled the air. The signature of the Garand, bang, 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 then the high, sharp ping as another empty clip flew free. The M1 was more than a rifle that morning. It was defiance made of steel. By 0800 hours, the Americans had clawed their way up the shingle. The 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions pressed inland, the Garands barking with relentless precision. Each squad's firepower, multiplied by the semi-automatic action, overwhelmed German defenders used to slower rifles. One German officer later wrote in his diary, "Their rifles never stop. It sounds like every man carries a machine gun." He wasn't far off. The first foothold of the invasion was secured not by tanks, not by artillery, but by the relentless advance of riflemen armed with a weapon that never faltered. The Garand fired through sand and rain, through blood and exhaustion. When the beach was finally quiet, it lay littered with shell casings, small brass monuments to industrial genius and human courage. Riley sat in the sand, shaking. He reloaded his weapon out of habit, hands trembling. Nearby, Sergeant Patterson clapped him on the shoulder. "You good kid," Riley nodded numbly. "Yeah, she didn't let me down." Patterson grinned, teeth white against the grime. "That's 'cause she's American, son." "Garand's performing flawlessly under combat conditions," one read. Another, from a captain on Omaha Beach, was more personal. "Tell Garand his rifle just won a war before lunch." In the armory's machine shop, John Garand read the message silently. He set it down, took off his glasses, and looked out the window toward the gray Massachusetts sky. Then he picked up a wrench and went back to work. Because for Garand, it wasn't about glory, it was about duty. And duty meant making sure the next rifle was even better. Back in France, the rifle's reputation grew with every battle. In the hedgerows of Normandy, soldiers used the Garand's rapid fire to clear enemy positions that would have been suicidal with bolt-action weapons. Each 8-round clip became a miniature thunderstorm of precision, short, controlled bursts that shredded German ambushes before they could recover. Corporal Riley wrote in his field diary that night, "The rifle feels alive. You pull the trigger and it answers. It kicks like truth itself." Patrols would freeze at the faint ping of an empty clip, the signal that an American rifleman was reloading, but the veterans soon realized it was often a trick. Clever soldiers began carrying empty clips in their pockets, tossing them into the dirt to bait Germans into exposing themselves. The ruse worked more than once. The weapon had become more than a tool. It was a language, a conversation between life and death, between engineering and instinct. That evening, as the smoke of Normandy drifted across the fields, the riflemen gathered around flickering lanterns. Their uniforms were soaked, their nerves raw, but they were alive. Each man leaned his rifle against a wall or foxhole beside him, careful not to let the muzzle touch the ground, an unspoken act of reverence. Private Riley stared at the weapon and said quietly, "She's the only thing here that never panicked." Patterson laughed. "She's got no reason to. Mr. Garand built her like a tank and tuned her like a violin." The men chuckled, and for a moment the fear faded. In that laughter, that camaraderie, that mechanical music of bolts and clips, the future of the war was already being written. Back home, newspapers printed the first photos of Garand rifles on the beaches. Headlines read, "The rifle that won the day. America's gun of freedom." Factories worked double shifts to replace the rifles lost to salt water and battle. The women on the line began signing the inside of the rifle stocks with chalk initials, hearts' names. Some soldiers would later find them in Europe and write back to the factory, "Whoever signed this one, it made it all the way to Berlin." Each one carried a story, a machinist's precision, a soldier's trust, a nation's hope. The rifle that had once been rejected, laughed at, and nearly scrapped had now become the iron heartbeat of an army that would not stop until tyranny was gone. And on the cliffs of Normandy, under the fading light, as the waves washed the sand clean of war, the sound that lingered wasn't the artillery or the screams. It was the faint metallic ping of freedom echoing into history. December 1944. The forest was deathly quiet. Snow fell in thick, muffled sheets that swallowed every sound except for the low crunch of boots. It was December 16th, 1944, in the frozen hell of the Ardennes, Belgium, the opening day of what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. Private David Stein, 1st Airborne Division, trudged through the snow, his breath fogging the air. The Garand hung across his chest, its stock wrapped in burlap against the cold. The weapon's metal was icy to the touch, but it was reliable as always, the one constant in a war that had turned unpredictable overnight. "Hey Dave," called his buddy Corporal Mason from behind him. "They say Jerry's throwing everything he's got at us. Tanks SS the works?" Stein exhaled a cloud of steam. "Good," he muttered. "Makes 'em easier to find." A thunderclap of artillery rolled through the pines, shaking snow from the branches. Shells screamed overhead, bursting among the treetops. Shards of wood and iron rained down like shrapnel. "Take cover," someone shouted. Men dove into frozen foxholes, clutching their helmets as the world exploded around them. When the barrage stopped, the air smelled of burned pine and cordite. Out of the smoke came Shadow's German infantry, in white camouflage, advancing fast. Stein chambered around, braced his rifle on the lip of his foxhole, and took aim. He fired once, the Garand cracked like a whip. A man fell. He fired again. Another flash, another target down. Around him the forest came alive with the rhythmic thunder of M1s. 8 shots. Reload. Ping. Clip in. Repeat. The German assault faltered almost immediately. They'd expected to find exhausted Americans on the verge of collapse. Instead, they met a storm of precision fire that shattered their advance. An officer screamed orders in the distance. The snow was painted black with smoke and red with blood. Mason shouted over the din. "They just keep coming." Stein reloaded, teeth gritted. "Then we keep shooting." A burst from an MG-42 tore through the branches above them, shredding the trees. Stein rolled to his side, aimed at the muzzle flash, and squeezed the trigger. The recoil kicked against his shoulder, steady, familiar, almost comforting. The gunner dropped. The forest fell quiet again, save for the hiss of snow melting on hot metal. In Bastogne, headquarters scrambled. Radio operators sent desperate calls, surrounded but holding. Ammunition low, weather worsening. Yet even in that encircled city, one weapon refused to surrender to the elements. The Garands fired through the ice, the mud, and the hunger. Soldiers used gloves, scarves, even socks to keep their hands from freezing to the metal, but they never stopped firing. A mechanic later wrote in his log, "Rifles frozen solid overnight. Warmed them over fires. All cycled perfectly by morning. God bless Garand. The Germans launched one last desperate push through the woods. The Americans, exhausted and half-starved, waited in their foxholes, fingers numb, eyes wide, hearts steady. When the attack began, the night exploded. Hundreds of M1s opened up at once, their synchronized volleys echoing through the forest like thunderclaps of defiance. The Garands spoke with cold, mechanical fury, 8 rounds reload, 8 more. Stein shouted to Mason over the roar, "They think they can freeze us out." Mason grinned through the powder smoke. "They can try." The two fired until their barrels smoked, until their hands ached from the cold and recoil. When dawn broke, the Germans were gone. The snow was trampled, scorched, and silent again. That morning, a thin sunlight broke through the gray clouds. The soldiers of the 101st cleaned their weapons with frozen rags, rubbing frost off the barrels. Stein checked his rifle's action smooth as ever. Not a jam, not a misfire. Mason looked at him and said quietly, "You think the guy who built these ever figured they'd be fighting in a damn blizzard?" Stein smiled. "If he did, he built it for us anyway." Outside, snow fell softly across the armory grounds. His assistant entered and handed him a telegram. Garand read it silently. M1 performance exceptional at Bastogne. Weapon operates flawlessly, despite extreme conditions. Morale high. Soldiers call it their best friend. He folded the telegram, looked out the window at the snow, and said softly to himself, "They deserve better than my best." The Garand had once again proven itself under impossible odds. A Time magazine correspondent wrote, "The battle was fought with courage, with stubbornness, and with a rifle that never gave up." When the war correspondent later visited the Springfield Armory, he asked Garand what he thought of the reports from Bastogne. The inventor smiled faintly and said, "It's not my rifle anymore. It belongs to them. They carved their initials into its stock. They slept with it beside them like a talisman. To them, it wasn't a weapon, it was survival forged by the hands of a quiet immigrant who'd never seen the battlefield, but somehow understood exactly what they needed." When the snow melted and spring finally came to Europe, thousands of Garands leaned against the walls of liberated towns, each one scratched, scarred, and shining in the sun. Each one a story, each one a victory. And though the war was far from over, one truth was already clear. America's destiny had been written not in speeches or flags, but in the cold, rhythmic thunder of 8 rounds at a time. Iwo Jima, February 1945. The ocean boiled beneath a sky of smoke. Amphibious landing craft plowed through the surf toward a black sand island that seemed to rise straight out of hell itself. It was February 19th, 1945, the opening day of the Battle of Iwo Jima. Corporal Hiroshi Mac Nakamura, 5th Marine Division, clutched his M1 Garand as his Higgins boat bucked violently in the swells. He could barely hear over the roar of engines and the thunder of naval guns pounding the island. Ahead, Mount Suribachi loomed like a dark tooth against the sky. 30 seconds, the coxswain yelled. Mac turned to the Marine beside him, Private Carter, barely 18 freckles hidden under grime and fear. Carter's lips were moving, whispering a prayer that was lost to the sea. The ramp dropped. Instant chaos. Machine gun fire from hidden bunkers cut through the first wave. Mortar shells exploded in geysers of black sand and flame. Men fell, screaming, rifles clutched tight, even as they sank beneath the surf. Mac hit the beach dove behind a sand ridge and spat out grit. The air smelled like sulfur and cordite. He slammed a fresh clip into his Garand, the metallic ping nearly drowned by the din of war. "Move up the ridge," came the order. They advanced one crater at a time, firing into invisible enemies. The Garand kicked against Mac's shoulder with every shot, steady, rhythmic, reliable. He could feel the heat of the barrel through his glove, smell the oil burning off the steel. It was the only thing that made sense in the madness. By noon, the beach was a graveyard. The Marines were pinned, surrounded by machine guns buried in the volcanic rock. Carter was hit. A bullet tore through his leg. Mac dragged him behind a wrecked Amtrak and laid down, covering fire, his Garand barking nonstop. A Japanese soldier broke from cover, charging with a bayonet fixed. Mac fired once, missed. Fired again, hit him square in the chest. The man collapsed in the sand, his rifle tumbling forward. Mac ejected the spent clip and reloaded the familiar ping-click-chonk echoing amid the screams and explosions. His heart was hammering, but his hands were steady. The next wave brought flame tanks and engineers with satchel charges. Mac's squad pushed up the ridge under a rolling barrage. For every 10 feet gained 5 Marines fell. But the riflemen never stopped firing. A lieutenant shouted over the din, "Heap, that fire steady. Don't waste a round." Mac fired, advanced fired again. Each shot precise, mechanical, disciplined. The Garand's 8-round rhythm became the heartbeat of the assault. Hours blurred together in blood and smoke. When they finally reached the lip of the ridge, Mac collapsed beside a crater, panting. He checked his weapon. The chamber was hot, the wood scorched, but it still cycled smooth as silk. In those same days across the Pacific, thousands of Garands were speaking the same language from the jungles of the Philippines to the mountains of Okinawa. The rifle that had been built in cold New England factories now roared through tropical storms and volcanic ash. Its design, gas-operated, semi-automatic, and nearly indestructible, was proving itself in every environment imaginable. A Marine major later wrote in his combat report, "We dropped them in mud, salt water, and blood. They fired every damn time." The wind howled through the twisted metal and scorched earth. He watched as a group of Marines raised a flag on the summit, a piece of cloth that would soon become the most famous image of the war. The men around him cheered, some cried, some just stared. Mac lifted his rifle and rested it against his shoulder, feeling the weight of it, heavy, solid, dependable. He looked over at Carter, leg bandaged but grinning. "Guess she made it," Carter said, nodding at the flag. Mac smiled. "Yeah, so did we." Mac sat apart, cleaning his Garand by the light of a flickering flame. He ran a rag down the barrel, checked the bolt, and smiled faintly at the engraving stamped into the receiver. U.S. Rifle Cal, 30 M1 Springfield Armory. He didn't know who John Garand was. Didn't know he was a quiet immigrant who'd spent years perfecting this weapon. But in that moment across the ashes of Iwo Jima, he silently thanked the man he'd never met. Meanwhile, back in Washington, D.C., word of the Pacific victories spread. Photographs from Iwo Jima reached the newspapers. In almost every image, Marines carried the same rifle, battered, blackened, but still gleaming with power. The American people began to understand what their factories had built, not just a weapon, but a lifeline. A senator touring the Springfield Armory told reporters, "If liberty had a sound, it would be the report of that rifle." Heat, humidity, and salt corroded everything except the M1. Its design handled the harshest conditions from Burma's jungles to the volcanic islands of Japan. A Japanese officer captured later would confess during interrogation, "We feared your rifle most. We called it the demon that never rests." Max sat on the sand at dusk, watching the ocean swallow the sun. The Garand lay across his knees, a thin wisp of smoke curling from the barrel. He looked at it like an old friend. "It's funny," he murmured to Carter. "You hold on to this thing long enough, it starts feeling like it's got a soul." Carter nodded, gazing toward the flag on Suribachi. Maybe it borrowed a bit of ours. The surf pounded against the beach, rhythmic and endless, like the rifle's fire, like the heartbeat of a nation that refused to yield. In the war's darkest hours, a quiet man's invention had spoken louder than any speech, louder than fear, louder even than death itself. And its voice, forged in steel and sweat, was the voice of freedom. April 1945, Germany. Rain swept across the German countryside in gray, slanting lines. The war was nearly over, but no one at the front believed it yet. Every barn, every tree line, every shadow could still hide a machine gun. In a burned-out village near Essen, Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Mills of the 99th Infantry crouched behind a shattered stone wall. His men were spread out along the street, a dozen figures in tattered uniforms, helmets streaked with mud. Across the square, the remains of a Panzer IV smoked quietly, its turret blown apart by a direct hit. "Keep your eyes open," Mills muttered into his throat mic. "We're not done here." Windows were blown out, doors torn from hinges, chickens wandering aimlessly through the rubble. Every few steps, someone's boot would crunch over spent brass or glass. Private Henderson pointed toward a cellar door hanging ajar. "Movement." Mills signaled silently. Two men approached, rifles aimed. "Cover me," one whispered. The door creaked open. Out stumbled two German soldiers barely older than boys. They dropped their weapons instantly, hands raised high. Their faces were hollow, pale, terrified. Mills gestured for them to step aside. "Search 'em, then move on," he ordered. He didn't feel hatred anymore, just exhaustion. The rifle in his hands felt heavier than ever, though it had saved his life more times than he could count. The Garand had become as much a part of him as the scars on his hands. Farther up the road, a sudden burst of MP-40 fire cracked through the air. The men dropped instantly, hugging the mud. "Top floor. Left window," Henderson yelled. Mills rolled behind a cart, flipped the safety off his Garand, and peered through the sights. The window flashed again. He fired once, twice, 3 times. The report was sharp, the recoil clean. After the third shot, silence. "Got him," someone murmured. Mills exhaled slowly. He could still smell the gunpowder, still feel the rifle vibrating in his hands. He ran his thumb across the stock over the dents and burn marks. Each one was a memory. By afternoon, the village was theirs. The men gathered in the courtyard of a half-collapsed farmhouse, sharing what little rations they had left. Rain dripped through holes in the roof, landing in metal helmets with soft, steady plinks. Sergeant O'Malley leaned back against a wall and tapped his Garand with affection. "Never thought I'd get sentimental over a chunk of steel," he said. "But this girl's been with me since North Africa. She's earned her keep." Someone chuckled tiredly. Mills smiled faintly, watching the steam rise from his coffee tin. If only Garand himself could see what his rifle's been through. O'Malley nodded. He'd probably build her tougher just to spite the war. Mills walked to the edge of the courtyard, staring out at the blackened fields. In the distance, artillery thundered the final spasms of a dying regime. He thought about how it had started the training back home, the endless drills, the first time he'd fired the M1. He remembered the recoil, the smell, the crisp precision. Now, after all the mudblood and years, it was the only sound that still made sense. The ping of an empty clip wasn't just metal, it was the punctuation mark of survival. That night, under a canvas shelter, Mills cleaned his rifle by lantern light. His hands moved with the slow rhythm of ritual wiping, oiling, checking, reassembling. He paused at the end, staring at the receiver. The stamped serial number caught the glow. Serial number 3478627. Just one of millions. Yet to him it was personal. He thought of all the men across 2 oceans who had carried identical rifles in jungles, on beaches in snow. Each had the same weight in their hands, the same fire in their hearts. Elsewhere in Germany, Allied units pushed forward, chasing the crumbling remains of the Wehrmacht. Entire divisions surrendered daily. And when they did, many German officers would ask to see the American rifle, the one they had heard so much about. One captured Oberst stared at the Garand Mills carried and said through an interpreter, "We were told your rifle was impossible, too complicated, too expensive. Now I see it was simply ahead of its time." Mills just nodded, handing it to a nearby corporal to wipe down. "Ahead of its time," he repeated quietly. "And right on time for us. Hitler dead. The Reich collapsing." No one cheered. They just sat in silence, listening to the rain tapping against their helmets. The war in Europe, the one that had consumed years and millions of lives, was ending. Mills looked down at his Garand, resting across his knees. He thought of the boys who hadn't made it, of the ones who'd dropped their rifles for the last time. He whispered, "We made it, old friend. You and me." The wind carried the faint scent of smoke and wet earth. In the fading light, the rifle's metal gleamed softly, a quiet reminder of the endurance that had brought them all this far. That night, Mills fell asleep with the Garand beside him, barrel pointed safely away, his hand resting on the stock. The war was ending, but the rifle and what it represented would endure. The next morning, he awoke to the sound of church bells ringing somewhere in the distance. He stood stretched and slung the rifle over his shoulder. It felt lighter now, because for the first time in years, it wasn't just a weapon, it was a witness. Summer 1945. The troop ship USS General W.P. Richardson rolled gently in the gray Atlantic swells, her decks packed shoulder to shoulder with exhausted men. Hundreds of duffel bags lined the railings, the smell of diesel salt and damp wool thick in the air. The war was over. For the first time in years, these soldiers weren't staring toward a front. They were staring homeward. Lieutenant Robert Mills leaned on the railing, cigarette hanging from his lips, his M1 Garand cased neatly at his side. The metal tags tied to its sling read, "Personal weapon retained by authority." He had fought from Normandy to the Ruhr. He had earned that right. A few feet away, Corporal Henderson grinned, tossing breadcrumbs to the gulls following the ship. "You gonna hang that thing over the fireplace?" he asked. Mills exhaled a stream of smoke. "No," he said. "Gonna keep it oiled, just in case." They both fell silent, listening to the waves slap against the hull. For years, that rhythmic sound had been replaced by the thunder of artillery and the bark of rifles. Now it almost felt too quiet. When the ship docked in New York Harbor, the Statue of Liberty rose from the mist, green, silent, and impossibly beautiful. Men crowded the rails' hats, waving, voices rising. Some laughed, others wept. Mills stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the skyline. He'd imagined this moment 1,000 times, the end of it all. But now that it was here, he couldn't quite believe it. An older sergeant beside him murmured, "We left as boys. We're coming back as ghosts." Mills nodded. Ghosts with Garands. Garand received a telegram from the War Department. "Congratulations. Your rifle has exceeded all performance and production expectations. General Patton has called it the greatest battle implement ever devised." Garand read the message alone in his office, surrounded by blueprints and prototypes. He smiled faintly, not pridefully, but with quiet relief. He thought of the factories that had run day and night, the women who had assembled triggers and stocks by hand, the soldiers who had trusted their lives to a design drawn years before the war even began. He whispered softly, as if to himself, it did its job. The Springfield Armory fell silent for the first time in years. No more clanging steel, no more roaring furnaces. The air smelled of oil and dust instead of gunpowder. Rows upon rows of M1 Garands stood stacked like soldiers at attention, awaiting storage or shipment to depots overseas. A foreman ran his hand across one rifle's smooth walnut stock and muttered, "If these could talk, they'd tell the whole damn story of the war." And he wasn't wrong. Across the country, returning veterans brought their rifles home not as trophies, but as reminders. They leaned them against porches, stored them in attics, sometimes mounted them on walls. Each carried the same weight of memory. Each had its scars, scratches from Normandy hedgerows, burn marks from Iwo Jima, dents from Ardennes stone walls. For many, the rifle was the one constant through chaos, the bridge between terror and survival. In towns from Ohio to Oregon, men told stories over beer and smoke, punctuated by that unmistakable sound, ping. That's when you knew you'd given it everything you had. When asked what they feared most on the battlefield, one colonel didn't hesitate. "Your artillery," he said, "and your riflemen. We could outnumber your tanks, but we could never outshoot your infantry." The M1 Garand, mass-produced in the millions, had turned ordinary farm boys into one of the deadliest infantry forces in history. Each man could fire 40-50 accurate rounds a minute more than twice the rate of a Mauser or Carcano bolt-action rifle. On paper, it was engineering. In practice, it was evolution. At the Army Ordnance Museum, Garand stood before a display of his creation, polished, engraved, and mounted under glass. A curator asked if he wanted to inscribe his name on the plaque. He declined. "It belongs to them," he said, "the ones who carried it." He reached out and ran a finger along the barrel, tracing the familiar shape. For a moment, his reflection merged with the rifle's steel inventor, and invention indistinguishable. Decades later, historians would write that America's industrial miracle had been its true secret weapon. But those who'd been there in foxholes, in jungles, on the decks of ships, knew it wasn't just factories or numbers. It was trust, a soldier's trust in a weapon that would never fail him. And for that, they would remember John Garand not as a legend, not as a hero, but as a man who gave their courage a voice. On September 2nd, 1945, the war finally ended. Aboard the USS Missouri, Japan signed the instruments of surrender. In cities across America, church bells rang, paper rained from skyscrapers, and people flooded the streets. In Springfield, Massachusetts, an elderly machinist from the armory stood outside his porch, listening to the noise on the radio. He smiled faintly and lifted his own M1 Garand skyward. "Good work, old girl," he whispered. "You earned your rest." From Normandy's beaches to Okinawa's cliffs, it had spoken for a generation. And in every battlefield it touched freedom echoed in its wake. Jean Garand died quietly in 1974. He never patented his design for profit. He lived modestly, never sought fame, and never stopped refining ideas for better, safer weapons. But to the men who had carried his rifle through the storms of history, his name was already immortal. They didn't call him inventor. They called him brother. Yet even today, when a Garand fires, its sound is unmistakable. A clean, sharp report followed by that familiar, beautiful ping. It's the sound of victory and of every man who fought to earn it.